Now let's get into the rec.parameters or the getRequests parameters. A parameter is a dynamic value anywhere on your endpoint that is represented by a colon as a prefix and a value as the suffix. So before we get into this, let's create an array of animals. Const animals, an array of objects that represent different animals, equals, let's give this first object of ID of 1. We'll say name Victor, and we'll give it the type of bird. And that's all. So we'll just copy this a few more times and make some new values. We'll give this an ID of 2, name of James, this is reptile, ID of 3, name of Kyle, and this will be a jaguar. And our last data set will be 4 with the name of Mary, and this can be a dog or a canine. So there you have it. We have animals and objects that have properties of ID, name, and the type of animal that we want to retrieve. Now, let's set up our endpoint for the rec.parameters. We'll say app.get animals colon and name, comma. So before we go any further, we're saying app.get the endpoint with animals and the colon, the parameter of a name. So think about the name you want to give this when you capture the request parameter. Let's send off with a function callback, rec res. I apologize. Let's go here. And let's console the params. So right now we have a name. Let's go to our browser and put something in here. Animals and test. Let's get the server running with npm run dev. Oh, app crashed. What happened? Error at 62. Oh, I didn't put some commas. My bad. We should be okay now. Great. So if we test the endpoint, it looks like we get nothing because we didn't say anything in our request parameters. So that makes sense. Now let's capture that param. Okay, let's say console.log rec.params. This is how you can access your parameter data. So let's send it again. In the console, we get name test. So we get an object. If you want to get the actual value of the object test, all you got to do is say the exact name or whatever you call it in your parameters in the URL. So let's go ahead and say dot name. Now we get test. You can even get creative with this. You can say, if you want to access a property, you can say for I in rec.params console.log I, which represents the property. If you want to see everything, you can say console.log, or if you want to see the value, you can say console.log rec.params of I. Let's say hello world. Now we get hello world. So this is how you can access the object. This is how you can manipulate it within your rec.params. And shoot, if you even wanted to go farther, you can add another rec.params anywhere you want. So you can say ID. Let's console it out just to verify. We'll send it up here in the URL. Let's give it an ID of 789. And we should see that in the console. It looks like we don't. Let's take this out. Hello world. Or let's say test and 789. Great. Now in our iteration, the for in rec.params, we are getting the console I, we are getting the property, and we are getting the value from the rec.params object. You can see that in the console by saying test. You see 789, you see name, test, ID, which represents the ID parameter, and 789 again. All right, so that's what it comes down to when it comes to accessing rec.params. So now if we want to access anything in the animals array of objects, let's test it out. Let's keep it simple and say we want to access a type. So type of animal, const animals, we're going to filter it out. Type of animal equals the animals array of objects dot filter function. We'll say animal and index. Now we return a method. We want to filter it out by the type of animal that we see. So we'll say return animal dot type equal to rec.params dot type. Now let's go over this. What we expect to happen here is that we filter an animal by its type. We want to get, if we type in bird in the URL, we get bird. If we type reptile, if we type jaguar, canine, we get that. Okay. Now, if it doesn't filter out, we are going to if we don't type in the right parameter or type, we should end up with an empty array representing that it doesn't match anything we typed in. Now, let's type this out with a valid type. We'll use jaguar, for example. Console.log type of animal to show in the console. Okay, if we go back to our URL, here is our home. We're going to end up with animals. Yes. And the type parameter, we are using jaguar. Okay, we should end up with that jaguar, the jaguar or ID of number 3 object within the animals array. Let's test it out. Great, and we do, because we filtered out the array and got the object by its type. Perfect. Now, if you want to get multiple objects within the array, we can add another parameter here. Make it cooler. We can add another parameter and say, let's call it limit. And this can represent something specific within our function. I'll comment that out. And let's put our function here, or our return statement. We're saying return animal's ID that shows up in the list that is less than or equal to the number that we put in. That way we can get all those objects less than the ID. So if we say, let's test it out. And we have to take out the type as well. We're not using type anymore. Limit we're going to capture animals endpoint, and let's get a limit of anything less than or equal to 2. We want to get objects less than or equal to the ID of 2. Okay, that's what we're comparing this to. And we expect to get these two here, James and Victor, reptile and bird respectively. So let's test this out. And that's exactly what we get. If you want to get anything greater, you can change up this comparison, greater than or equal to, where we should get 1, 2, and 3 if we use the 2. Let's try it. And we do. We get 2, IDs 2, 3, 4, with all its respective properties. So that's how powerful rec.params can be. If you want to do a regex, we can get creative. Now, let's say if rec.params dot, let's change this up to Word. So I'm just changing my endpoint to Word on the get request. Now let's go back to our new if statement. If rec.params.word. Now I want to test this with the regex. Test. I'm sorry, I'm going backwards here, but I'll explain what I'm doing. Now, we're saying if this regex.test rec.params.word, if it's validated by the regex and it matches in some kind of way, however we configure the regex, then we should go into our method. Else wrong regex input. Let's console that. All right, now let's go ahead and fix this. If, let's say, if the word contains car, and we'll have a global scope, so we can see anything with car in it. .test word. If it's true, res.json message rec.params.word. Else console.log wrong input on the regex and res.json error wrong regex input. Now let's explain this again. If I'm saying if the car is tested positive, or if it's true by the rec.params.word, our input, then we'll send res.json message and the word that we put in, which shows as true. Else, we're just putting in a custom false statement saying, okay, we'll send something back to the client saying error as a property, and they can access this error from the client side, and it shows them the string wrong regex input, as well as the terminal or the console. So after explaining that, let's demonstrate and see how this is going to work. If this rec.params.word does match with the regex car, so I can type in anything as long as it has car inside of the string. Okay, animals and parameter of word. Let's use toy, which has nothing to do with car. We get a message back to the client with the object error, wrong regex input, as well as the console. Now let's put something in correctly. We can say car. Sweet, it works perfectly. We can say scar. Works perfectly. Madagascar. Works perfectly fine. Okay, so that's the power of the regex when it comes to rec.parameters. You can even argue it's for security purposes. Feel free to argue against it with something that you don't even want to include. So if you say, let's say we have a list of allowed inputs, right? If you want to make it real secretive, we'll say const allowed inputs equals 1, 2, and 3. And by the way, this can be anything. Tree. This is my Jamaican side. Const allowed inputs equals 1, 2, and 3. Okay, so let's comment this out, come back down, create a fresh graph for what we need to do, and let's call it allowed origins. If allowed in, is that what I said? Allowed inputs? Okay, allowed inputs. If allowed inputs dot includes rec dot params dot word. Let's go backwards. If allowed inputs doesn't include rec.params.word, then we will throw, we'll say throw new error, and we'll give the console of wrong input made, res.json error, wrong input. Else, if it does meet, if it does match one of these 3 values in the array, 1, 2, or 3, then we can say res.json message success with plus rec.params.word. Okay, so let's go over this again. I'm saying if the allowed inputs, our array of allowed inputs, 1, 2, or 3, if allowed inputs includes rec.params.word, if it shows up in any of them, if we put in 1, 2, or 3, but in this case, if it doesn't match, because we're testing for false, if it doesn't match, then we're going to throw a new error and say wrong input made. And I don't believe we can send that JSON right now. Let's cancel that out. But we'll do that, and we'll send an else of res.json success with rec.params.word. Now let's go into testing and test it out. Let's say 5. We get an error, wrong input made. Cool. Let's use 1. And we get the string success with 1. Let's try 2. Cool, we get 3. Success with 3. So this is the power, again, of the rec.params function here when we request parameters dynamically within an endpoint. Now let's go over this one last time as a summary. We created an endpoint called app.get with a URL, or an endpoint of animals and a parameter of word. Okay, we've had other parameters in here. We've had limit and we've had type with the type example. Now when using these parameters, they're going to be as strongest as your weakest link. So be sure that if you're not using anything related to type, please be sure to delete that and bring it back later if you want to practice. All right, so once we have these endpoints in that represent data here within any part of the URL, okay, we send a callback with the function recres, and we go into our various methods to get into the client browser, access certain data, filter. We have, what do we have here? We have rejects. So if anything with the word car matches the endpoint, then it should show up, or else we throw an error or say console.log wrong rejects. And finally, we end up with allowed inputs that we use to argue as an array and compare that against the input word. Okay, so we take this array and compare it against word to see if the word is 1, 2, or 3, and it should match and be a positive result. But if it doesn't, if it's anything else but that, right, then it should throw an error, which it did. So I will comment this out, and that is rect.params.